The musicians had been playing for 3 hours when the Duke of Ashvale stopped in the center of the ballroom floor and looked at her. Not at Lady Prescott, whose cream silk had been discussed at 3 morning calls and 2 luncheons before the evening even began. Not at Miss Cavendish Poole, whose diamond tiara caught the candlelight and scattered it across the ceiling in arcs that several young gentlemen found impossibly romantic. Not at any of the 12 women whose mothers had spent the better part of the autumn positioning them within his sightline, calculating angles of approach the way a general calculates artillery. He looked at the girl carrying the tray of empty crystal along the east wall, the one in the gray dress with the white apron pressed so crisp it still held its fold lines from the iron, and the room held its breath for one suspended and impossible moment. Nora Fenn had counted 12 sconces in the east corridor and 4 in the antechamber, and had memorized, in her first week at Ashvale House, the precise route that would let her move from the kitchens to the ballroom gallery and back again without crossing the center of any room where important people were doing important things. She was 22 years old and had been a housemaid at Ashvale House for 7 months, and she knew, as all housemaids knew, that invisibility was not simply a convenience. It was the whole of the job. She did not see him look. She was watching the tray. He crossed the floor in 11 strides. The musicians did not stop, but the nearest violinist missed a note, and the woman who noticed that missed note first. Lady Aldwych, the Dowager Duchess of Aldwych, standing at the room's north end with her fan held open at a precise measuring angle, turned her head 1 degree to follow the direction of his attention. What she saw made the fan close with an audible snap. Beside her, Miss Cavendish Poole had gone very still, in the way of a person who has seen something land in a room and has not yet calculated the exact shape of the damage. This is the story of one night in the autumn of 1814, at the most attended ball in the county, and of a young woman who had made herself so thoroughly invisible that when someone finally saw her, neither she nor anyone else in the room knew what to do with the fact. If you have ever felt unworthy of being looked at directly, stay with this one. She did not expect it either. Nora Fenn had arrived at Ashvale House in the 2nd week of March, recommended by her late father's solicitor to the housekeeper, Mrs. Carow, on the strength of 2 things. Her father had been a country curate of decent reputation, and the previous 3rd housemaid had left abruptly to marry a Derbyshire farrier. The 2 qualifications were equal in Mrs. Carow's estimation. A decent reputation meant the girl would not steal the silver. An empty position meant the girl was needed at once. She had arrived in the rain with a small trunk and a face that Mrs. Carow described to the cook as sensible. Not pretty in the way that caused problems, not plain in the way that caused different problems. Sensible, which in a household of 41 servants and 1 duke of uncertain temperament was the only quality that reliably made a morning run smoothly. The cook had said she looked like a person who had been reading when she was interrupted, and Mrs. Carow had said that was neither here nor there, and they had both been right. What Mrs. Carow did not mention, because it was not her habit to mention things that did not immediately affect the running of the house, was that she read Latin. Her father had taught her from the age of 8, not from any radical conviction about the education of women, but simply because he was a man who loved language, and she was the only person in the parsonage who sat still long enough to learn it. She had learned the language the way you learn a house in winter, room by room, through the cold. When the Reverend Fenn died in January of pneumonia, and the parsonage was required for his successor within a fortnight, Nora had packed her books last, fitting them into the corner of the trunk around her good dress and the small watercolor portrait of her mother. She had not wept at leaving. Sensible was a word she had adopted the way a country under occupation adopts the language of the occupier, because it was the cost of remaining. She had been sensible through 7 months of fireplace blacking and rug beating and lamp trimming and silver polishing and the endless careful calculation of where to stand and where not to. She had been sensible through the August house party, when she had spent 4 days moving between occupied guest rooms like a ghost, seeing the visitors at their least guarded. She had been sensible through the afternoon in the library 3 weeks before the ball, when she had been dispatched to carry a letter from the steward to the writing room, and had found, instead of an empty writing room, His Grace the Duke of Ashvale sitting at the desk in his shirt sleeves, reading a Latin text with what she could only describe, later, to the cook's assistant who had asked her to describe him, as grief. Not anger. Not the cold abstraction she had been told to expect from a man who did not speak to his own household unless something was broken. Grief, specific and contained, the way a candle held in a cupped hand is a private thing even in a crowded room. His jaw was set, and his eyes were moving slowly over the page, and his right hand was resting flat on the desk beside the open book, as though steadying it, or steadying himself, and the room had about it the quality of a place where someone has recently wept and is doing their best not to continue. She had set the letter on the corner of the desk without speaking. She had not looked at the book, except that she had looked at the book, and she had seen it was Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, the passage in the 9th book about the nature of loss, and she had felt, without permitting herself to feel it, a complicated sympathy for a man she was not allowed to know. The passage was the one that asked whether a thing diminishes when it is taken from us, or whether we diminish, and what the difference is if the result is the same. And she had read it 7 years ago in the parsonage on a cold Tuesday, and had thought about it on and off ever since. He had not looked up. She had not announced herself. She had left. This was the whole of their acquaintance before the ball, and it had lasted less than 90 seconds, and she had thought about it with a frequency she considered unreasonable for a thing that had comprised no conversation and no acknowledgement. The Duke of Ashvale was 34 years old, which the county considered wasted. He had inherited the dukedom at 26, which the county considered young. He had declined to remarry after the death of his wife 4 years ago, which the county considered, depending on who was being consulted, either touching or inconvenient. He was not prone to sentiment in any visible way. He managed his estate with an attention to detail that his steward, who had served his father before him, called exacting and occasionally called exhausting. He was civil at public events in a way that communicated, very precisely, that civility was a discipline he had chosen and could equally well put down. To the season, he was simply the most eligible unmarried man in 3 counties, and the season had been saying so, with increasing frustration, for 4 years. His name passed through morning rooms like weather. He was discussed at tables he had not attended, and mentioned in letters between mothers who had never met each other, because the shared project of directing his attention required coordination. Lady Aldwych had said so most recently, that very morning, in the green parlor, to 3 assembled mothers and Miss Cavendish Poole herself, who sat with her hands folded and her back straight, and understood that she was being arranged. "The Duke of Ashvale," Lady Aldwych had said, "has allowed sufficient time for mourning. A man of his station requires an heir. The matter is not romantic, it is procedural, and Louisa is the most suitable candidate in the county." She had paused, opening her fan. "The ball is tonight. He will see sense." She had been saying variations of this for 6 months. What the Duke had been doing, in the months preceding the autumn ball, was a thing no one in his household could have named exactly, because it did not have a name. He worked. He read. He rode out in the early mornings when the grounds were empty and the mist was still on the field edges, and the world had the quality of a place that had not yet decided what kind of day it was going to be. Once in the 2nd week of October he had passed the kitchen garden and seen, from 30 yards distance, a housemaid on her knees in the mud, pulling the last of the autumn parsley, and she had been singing to herself in a low voice, something careful and internally rhymed that he could not make out from where he stood. He had not moved for longer than was warranted by any business he could name. He had not seen her face. He had told himself this was the reason the moment stayed with him. He returned to it the way one returns to a sentence that has not closed. This was the explanation he gave himself, and he was a man of sufficient self-awareness to recognize that he was explaining himself to himself, which was its own answer. He had not acted upon it. He had continued his mornings. The night of the ball arrived in the manner of all evenings that have been anticipated to the point of exhaustion. The carriage lights were lit at dusk. Mrs. Caro directed the staff through the kitchen at a pace that was controlled and not to be questioned. Nora was assigned to the East Gallery, with instructions to carry, to collect, to remain along the wall, to be neither seen nor heard in any way that would register to a person in full evening dress attending to their own affairs. She wore the gray dress with the white apron. She wore the cap. She had, that morning, pressed both until the fold lines were visible, because a rumpled uniform was a uniform that drew attention, and attention was the one thing she was not permitted to draw. She had been told this, directly, by Lady Aldwick's maid, who had come 3 days before the ball to make arrangements for the dowager's accommodation. The maid had said it in the way that people say things they believe require no particular gentleness. Lady Aldwick takes note of the presentation of lower staff at formal entertainments. See to it that your girl is properly turned out and stays to her station. She had been addressing Mrs. Caro. She had been looking at Nora. The households that allow their maids to wander into company do the servants themselves no favors. It only invites misunderstanding. It creates confusion in the minds of people who should not be confused, and a confused mind defaults to the simplest explanation, which is never charitable to a housemaid. Mrs. Caro had said yes, of course, and Nora had said nothing, and the maid had left, and the cook had said, in Nora's hearing, and Mrs. Caro's, "A housemaid who wanders into company. I have never seen such a thing, and I have been in service 30 years. And Nora had smiled, the small sideways smile she permitted herself when no one important was watching, and had gone to press the apron. The ball proceeded as balls in 1814 proceeded, with music and conversation and the careful public management of private interest. The room was full of women in the first quarter of the evening light, silks catching and scattering, shoulders bare above the candle flame. The orchestra was placed behind the east columns and was playing well. Nora moved. The tray was never too full, and never too empty. She took the south route from the kitchens, and the east route back. And she had passed through the gallery 3 times without incident. And she was crossing the east wall toward the service door, eyes on the tray, when she heard the room change. She did not hear it as a sound. She felt it as a pressure, as 100 people had been producing 100 varieties of sound, and in the space between one breath and the next, the overall density of that sound shifted, and something in the room became directed. And she looked up. The Duke of Asheville was 2 feet away, and moving toward her at the measured pace of a man who has decided something and sees no particular reason to be hurried about executing it. She stopped. He stopped. She was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with rational thought, of exactly how far the service door was, and exactly how impossible it would be to reach it before he spoke. She was also aware of the precise quality of attention the room had developed, the way 100 faces had found the same angle without any coordination, because that is what faces do when something has broken the rules that everyone agreed to, and no one wrote down. "Miss?" he said, and the word was plain, the way marble is plain. She did not curtsy. She stood very still, and then curtsied, because standing still had been the first instinct, and she had recognized it was wrong. "Your Grace," she said. "Will you dance?" he said. The room was not silent. The musicians were still playing. The conversations were still proceeding. And yet she could not hear any of it, because those 3 words had landed in the middle of the room with the weight of something dropped from a considerable height, and the fall had not finished yet. "I am afraid," she said carefully, "that I am on duty, Your Grace." "You will be off duty for 1 dance," he said. "Give the tray to the footman at the south column." This was not a question. It was a command in the syntactical form of an instruction, and it was delivered in the level, quiet voice of a man who understood authority as a thing that did not require volume to function. She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. His eyes were the color of slate after rain, steady and without the performance of steadiness. He was not smiling. He was looking at her with an attention that she had spent 7 months not receiving from anyone in this house, and it was a more uncomfortable sensation than invisibility had ever been, because invisibility had a shape she understood, and this did not. She gave the tray to the footman at the south column. She had, in her life, danced 3 times. Once at her father's harvest gathering, when she was 15, with the sexton's son who had stepped on her feet twice and apologized 4 times. Once at a neighbor's wedding, with a cousin from Bath who had been very kind and very dull. And once alone in the parsonage kitchen, the week after her father's funeral. To no music at all, because she had needed to move in a way that was not grief, in a way that was simply the body doing what it was made for, without obligation to anyone. She had not, in any of these instances, danced with a duke, and she was aware, as he placed one hand at her waist, and she placed her fingers in the crook of his arm, that every piece of education her father had given her applied precisely to nothing about this moment. She was aware of the warmth of his hand through the layers of gray wool and white linen. Specific in the way warmth is when you have not expected it, and cannot dismiss it once it has arrived. The dance was a country dance, which required figures, which required a focus on the steps, which was the only reason she did not make a complete disaster of the first 30 seconds. She focused on the steps. He was good at the dance in the way that men of his station were good at it, without visible effort, and without the kind of performance that signals awareness of being watched. He was watching her. She could feel it in the quality of his stillness between figures, the way the air around him had a specific consistency when his attention was directed at a thing. "You have been in the household since March," he said. It was not phrased as a question. "Yes, Your Grace." "You are the curate's daughter." She looked up. He had been speaking to his steward, evidently. "I am," she said. "Mr. Fenn of Fenwick Parish. He died in January." "I know," he said, and the simplicity of it, the way he did not dress it in condolence or ceremony, made it easier to hear than condolence would have been. It was an acknowledgement, not a performance of feeling, and she found it, unexpectedly, kind. They moved through the next figure. The room around them had not resumed its normal density. She could feel the attention the way one feels weather, as a quality of pressure against the skin. And she kept her chin level and her shoulders straight the way her father had taught her to stand when she did not want anyone to know she was afraid. "You were reading in the library," he said. "The afternoon of the Linton letter." Her hand, resting at his arm, stilled for one moment, and then continued. "I was not reading, Your Grace," she said. "I was carrying a letter." "You were reading the text on the desk." She met his eyes. They were level, without accusation, without the edge of a man who has caught someone doing something wrong. He was stating a fact. The look was curious and direct, and entirely without contempt, which was its own disorienting quality. Briefly, she said. Which passage? The 9th book, she said, before she could stop herself. The section beginning with the question of what a thing loses when it is taken from us. He turned them through the final figure, and the music resolved, and they were standing still, and the room around them had a quality of attention she had only felt once before, which was in a church when the sermon had gone very quiet and very true, and the congregation had stopped adjusting themselves and simply listened. He kept her hand for one moment past the close of the dance. "Thank you," he said. She curtsied and retrieved her hand and walked to the service door at the exact pace she always walked, without hurrying, because hurrying would have been readable, and pushed through it, and leaned against the wall in the kitchen corridor, and was very thoroughly, silently overwhelmed. Her heart was doing something impractical. She stood until it finished, which took some time, and then she walked to the kitchen, and the cook looked at her, and neither of them said anything, and the cook poured her a cup of tea that was too strong, which was the cook's way of saying something she did not have words for. Lady Aldwych found the Duke within 4 minutes of the dance's end. She had not moved from the north end of the room during the dance. She had stood with her fan open at the same angle, and her spine straight, and her face in the expression she had cultivated for 30 years, which communicated calm authority, even when the interior was doing something quite different. The interior, presently, was furious, and organizing that fury into its most useful form, which was not a raised voice, but a careful, specific argument delivered at close range. "Your Grace," she said, when she had reached him. "Lady Aldwych," he said. "I believe there has been some confusion," she said. Her voice was pitched low, the way a woman pitches a voice when she is choosing the field of engagement deliberately. "The girl is one of your housemaids. She is not here as a guest. I do not say this unkindly, Your Grace, only that it is the sort of episode that, if spoken of, does the household no credit, and the girl herself a disservice. People will talk. People are talking presently," he said. "I observe no particular disaster. With respect," she said, "that is because the matter has only just occurred. If allowed to stand as anything more than a momentary eccentricity, the damage to the girl's own position would be considerable. She would be dismissed from most households simply for having been placed in this situation. It reflects on her judgment." She had deployed this argument because it was her best one, not the social embarrassment, which he plainly did not feel, not the insult to Miss Cavendish Poole, whose color had not recovered, and who was being managed at this moment by her own mother at the south end of the room. The girl. The girl's own damage. She watched him take it in the way she watched every argument she deployed, with the attention of a woman who had built her authority on the ability to read which arguments had landed. "You believe it reflects on her judgment," he said. "Any young woman who allows herself to be drawn into company above her station," Lady Aldwych said carefully, "opens herself to the suggestion that she sought the attention. It is not fair, but it is how these things are understood. The season does not deal in intentions. It deals in what is seen." "She did not seek it," he said. "I sought it." "Yes," said Lady Aldwych, who was a woman who could recognize when she had handed someone a weapon and watched them understand its use. "That is precisely the difficulty." He looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate your concern for her," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested sarcasm, which meant he meant it, which was the most disorienting thing he had done all evening. "I will attend to it." Lady Aldwych had been in society for 40 years, and she understood, without requiring him to elaborate, that attending to it meant something entirely different to him than it meant to her. She returned to the north end of the room with her fan held at the same angle, and she was, for the remainder of the evening, very still. The following morning was gray and still. Nora carried coals and trimmed lamps, and did not speak of the previous night to anyone, not because she had been instructed not to, but because she was not certain what she would say if she tried. The cook had looked at her when she came down for breakfast, with the look of a person who knows something, and has decided not to say it. The look was enough. Mrs. Caro came to her at 9:30 in the second-floor corridor, with the particular expression she wore when delivering news that had originated somewhere above her authority. "His Grace wishes you to attend in the study at 10 o'clock, she said. Nora set down the lamp oil. "Yes, Mrs. Caro." "He has instructed me to say," Mrs. Caro continued, with the careful inflection of a woman reading from an internal document, "that this is not a matter touching your employment. I do not know what it touches. I am to accompany you." At 10 o'clock, they entered the study. The Duke was at his desk. He rose when they entered, which was not a thing Nora had expected, and which Mrs. Caro registered with a blink that she recovered from immediately. There was a third person in the room. She was perhaps 60, slight, with close gray hair and the quality of attention that Nora had learned to associate with people who had been scholars of something for a long time. She was seated in the chair beside the fire, with her hands folded, and her eyes, when they found Nora's, entirely awake. "This is Mrs. Hollowell," the Duke said. "She has been the librarian and reader for the estate of Linfield since 1801. She is presently without a position, as Linfield is to be sold. I am establishing a proper library for the estate, to be catalogued and managed with the attention it requires. The position requires someone with Latin and the patience for a disordered collection." He looked at Nora. "I have not yet offered the position to anyone," he said. "I wish to speak with Mrs. Hollowell in your presence, so that you might ask any question you chose before forming a judgment. You would move from household staff to a position of independence. Your own rooms in the East Wing. You would report to the household but not be directed in your hours by it. The work is the catalogue, the maintenance of the collection, and reading aloud at my instruction when I require it." He paused. "I am aware this is not a conventional proposal." "No," Nora said. "I am aware," he said, "that you may consider it only marginally less unusual than last evening." She looked at him. He was standing at the desk in the morning light. Neither the abstracted grief she had seen in the library nor the public authority of the ballroom. He was a man making a specific, deliberate offer to a woman whose position made it strange, and he had made it anyway, with his housekeeper in the room as witness. "May I speak with Mrs. Hollowell?" she asked. "That is why she is here," he said. She spent 20 minutes with Mrs. Hollowell, who turned out to be both learned and direct, and who described the work with the precision of someone who had loved it for 2 decades and saw no reason to dress it as anything other than what it was. The collection at Linfield had been 3,000 volumes. The collection at Ashvale was perhaps 800, disordered, acquired in 3 different generations, with 3 different philosophies, and none of them particularly organized. There were volumes in the Latin alcove that were not Latin. There were volumes that had been shelved by color. There was, Mrs. Hollowell said, with the dry understatement of the professionally dedicated, a significant quantity of work. She also said, without being asked, that a private library catalogued with rigor and maintained with care was the kind of project that could occupy a good mind for years and produce something that outlasted the person who had made it. and that this was, in her view, not the smallest thing a person could do with their time. When Nora returned to the Duke's desk and said yes. "Good," he said. Mrs. Caro said nothing at all, and said it in a tone that communicated she would be saying a great deal of it later, in the kitchen, to the cook. The weeks that followed had a quality of gradual approach, which was appropriate because they were the weeks in which two people who had been invisible to each other by the operation of social machinery began to become visible in ways that had no established name. He came to the library in the afternoons. Not every afternoon, perhaps 3 days in 5, and she was usually on a ladder with a ledger, or at the long table with a dustcloth and an open text, and he would sit in the chair by the window and read in the way that he read, which was without performance, without the public room quality that most people carried into all of their occupations. Occasionally, he would say the name of something he was looking for, and she would find it and carry it to his chair and return to the table. This was the whole of the arrangement for the first week, and it was, she recognized, the first time in 7 months that she had been in a room with another person and not been required to reduce herself to her function. In the second week, he asked what she was reading. She told him. He did not say anything immediately, and she had learned, in those 2 weeks, that his silences were not the silences of a man who was not listening. They were the silences of a man who was attending to something more carefully than convention required. "That is the copy my wife read. She had marked the margins. She looked at the text in her hands. There were small pencil marks at intervals, careful and thoughtful, the kind that indicate a reader taking argument seriously and writing back to it. Short marks, mostly, arrows and underlining and occasional single words in a hand that was neat and very small. One annotation in the margin of the 3rd chapter said only, "This is not how it is," and there was something in the disagreement that felt entirely alive, as though the person who had written it was still, in some way, present. "I can find another copy if you would prefer," she said. "No," he said. "I had forgotten the marks were there. I am not sorry to be reminded." She kept the copy. She read the annotations alongside the text, and she found that she liked the woman who had made them, which was not a thing she had expected to find in a book. She learned, in pieces, the shape of what had happened 4 years ago. Not from him, not directly, but from the house itself, which held its history in small objects and small silences the way all houses hold their histories, layered beneath the working surface of daily life. There was a portrait in the upper gallery that was never covered despite convention suggesting it might have been. A woman of perhaps 28, with dark hair and direct eyes, and the particular expression of a person who is attending to something beyond the frame. There was a piano in the east drawing room that was never played, but was kept tuned because he had instructed the instrument tuner to continue on a quarterly schedule, which was not the instruction of a man who had finished with the piano. There was a dedication in one of the early volumes she catalogued, in a hand she recognized from the margins, that said only, "For Edward, who will read this when I cannot." The ink was faded, the way ink fades when it has been read more than once. She understood from these things that his wound was not the abstracted melancholy of a man who had been generally unfortunate. It was the specific grief of a man who believed he had been absent when it mattered. He had been in London on a state business when his wife took ill. She had not sent word until the 3rd day. He had arrived on the 4th. She had lived 3 more days. This was the arithmetic he carried. 3 days. A letter. The distance he had thought was safe. She did not speak of this directly. There was nothing to say that the books had not already said better, And she was not a woman who believed that language must always be used when silence would serve. What happened instead was that she found, in the late weeks of November, a letter tucked between the pages of a volume of Virgil on the third shelf of the south alcove. It was sealed, still sealed after 4 years, with a small plain wax seal, and addressed in the hand she recognized from the margins. The addressee was the Duke. She could see his name in those careful letters, and she held the letter for a long moment before she set it down. She placed it on his desk without comment, not against the wall, not on the edge, but in the center, where it would be the first thing he saw. She did not leave a note. She did not explain. She placed it and returned to the catalog and did not, that afternoon, look at the desk again. She did not know if it was the right thing. She knew it was the true thing, which was not always the same, and in this case was. He did not come to the library the following afternoon, nor the one after that. Lady Aldwych arrived at Ashvale House on the third day, with Miss Cavendish Poole and a maid, in the manner of a woman who has decided to move the siege to the walls themselves and does not intend to leave without a result. She called on the Duke in the formal drawing room and spent 40 minutes there. Nora, who was in the library above, could not hear the conversation, but she could hear the quality of the silence in the house during those 40 minutes, which was different from the silence before, the silence of a house holding itself careful and waiting. She heard the carriage leave. She continued with the catalogue. That evening, passing through the upper corridor toward the east wing, she saw Lady Aldwych and Miss Cavendish Poole at the top of the main stairs. Lady Aldwych stopped. "The librarian," she said, not to her companion, and not entirely to Nora. "There is a pleasant fiction." Miss Cavendish Poole looked at the floor. "You are a housemaid," Lady Aldwych said, "who was given a fancy title and a different corridor. I say this not unkindly. I say it because you would do well to understand what this situation actually is before you build any further architecture around it. His Grace is a man under a particular strain, and people under strain do unusual things. And those unusual things have consequences for people of your station that they do not have for a man of his." Nora looked at her. Lady Aldwych was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had learned that the world ran on a certain kind of order and had spent 60 years maintaining her position at its center. Her concern was real, in its way. It was simply organized around a premise that Nora could not share. "Lady Aldwych," Nora said with the care she gave to things she had decided to mean, "I have built nothing." "That," said Lady Aldwych, "is precisely what concerns me." She swept past with her companion, and the corridor settled behind them, and Nora continued to the east wing, and the corridor was very long and very cold at this hour. And at the end of it, the fire in her room had gone low, because she had forgotten to tell the girl to keep it. She sat in the chair beside the cooling hearth, and was, for a long hour, thoroughly uncertain. Not about the work. Not about the letter on the desk, or what she had meant by placing it there. Uncertain about whether she had, without intending to, built something anyway. The way you build a fire by adding one piece of wood at a time, each piece small enough to be ordinary, until the accumulation is undeniable. The next afternoon he came back to the library. He did not speak for the first 10 minutes. He sat in the chair by the window, with the window behind him full of gray November, and the kind of stillness that comes after a person has been somewhere very difficult and has returned to a room that is familiar. She continued at the catalogue, and the fire was good, and the room smelled of books and wood smoke, and the silence between them had changed in a way she could feel in the quality of the air, without being able to explain what specifically had altered. The letter was from her physician. He had written it after her death to explain what had happened. She had known she was ill before she sent word to me. She had waited because she did not want me to see her frightened. His voice was level and entirely steady, and she understood that the steadiness had cost something. She arranged for the letter to be sent with the rest of her papers, but it was misfiled. It had been in the Virgil for 4 years. Nora set down her pen. She wrote the dedication in the Virgil the week she first took ill, he said. She hid the physician's letter in the same volume, deliberately. She knew I would find it eventually, when I could bear to look through her books carefully enough. He was looking at the window. The light on his face was the flat gray light of late November, which is honest in the way that theatrical light is not. And in it, he looked like a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has just been shown a door. I had spent 4 years believing I had arrived too late. She had spent her last days arranging to tell me that she had not wanted me earlier. She had chosen the timing herself. She gave herself those 3 days. Nora said nothing. There was nothing that required saying. Sometimes the right response to a person's grief is simply to remain in the room, steady, without filling the space with words that are really about your own discomfort at the size of someone else's feeling. You put the letter on the desk, he said. Yes, she said. Why? She thought about this honestly. Because it was her intention, she said, that you should have it. Whatever she said in it was already hers to say. I only moved it to where it could do what she meant it to do. It seemed to me that was the whole of the task. He was looking at her now, with the same quality of attention he had brought to the dance floor, to the morning in the library, to the offer of the position, direct, specific, without any of the social machinery that most people keep running at all times to prevent the full weight of their attention from landing on another person. Nora, he said. It was the first time. It landed in the room as a marked event, the way such things land when they have been held in deliberate abeyance and are finally released into the air. Her given name in his voice was a different word from her given name in anyone else's. It was her name as a thing chosen rather than assigned. And the difference was the entire difference. And she felt it in the base of her throat and the backs of her hands and the stillness of her chest. She said, Your Grace. Edward, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 34 years old, and he had been carrying 4 years of mistaken arithmetic and a dead wife's love like 2 separate weights that did not know about each other, and she had moved one letter from one place to another, and the machinery of his grief had shifted by some increment. She could not measure but could see in the quality of light in the room, in the way he was sitting in the chair differently from how he had sat in it before. She said his name. The word was careful and quiet and entirely real. He stood and came to where she was standing at the table, and the distance between them was the specific small distance of people who have decided something without yet having said it aloud. And he took her hand, the one that was not still holding the pen, and he held it without speaking for a moment. That did not need to be shorter than it was. She was aware of the warmth of his hand, and some quality of pulse in it she could not entirely attribute. I should tell you, he said, that Lady Aldwych believes this is a pleasant fiction. She told me so, Nora said. What did you say? I said I had built nothing. He looked at her hand for a moment, and then at her. She is wrong, he said. You have built the catalogue of 800 volumes to a standard that Mrs. Hollowell called In her letter to me last week, the best she has seen in a private collection in 20 years. He held her hand a degree closer. She is wrong about other things as well. I know, Nora said. He brought her hand to his lips. It was the warmth of his mouth against her knuckles, without gloves, in a candle-lit library in November, and the held breath between them was audible in the quiet room, and the fire said something small and constant behind them, and she did not look away, and he did not look away, and the accumulation of small ordinary pieces had become something undeniable. I am not asking you to make a decision tonight, he said. I know, she said again. I am asking you to allow the question to remain open. She thought of her father reading Latin in the cold parsonage study with a single candle and an old blanket, and the conviction that language was a kind of companionship that persisted past the life of the person who had taught it. She thought of the letter in the Virgil, and the woman who had written it for a man she trusted to find it when he was ready, who had given him the gift of 3 days of her own choosing. She thought of the autumn kitchen garden, and the song she had been singing to herself for no reason, except that it was in her and needed to be outside, and the morning she had not known anyone was listening. The question, she said, has been open for some time. He had the look of a man who has been handed back something he had not known he dropped. It was not quite a smile. It was the movement behind a smile, which is the better thing. More private and more real. The formal announcement was made in the second week of December in the manner of all Regency announcements, which is to say by way of a letter from the Duke's solicitor to the relevant parties, followed by a brief notice in the Morning Post that occupied 4 lines and was read by Lady Aldwych at breakfast with a cup of tea that cooled untouched beside her. She sat with it for some time. She was not, in the end, a foolish woman, and she recognized, in the privacy of her own morning room, that she had been looking at the situation through the wrong instrument. She had been calculating advantage, which was what she knew how to do, and he had been doing something else entirely, which was what he had always done. Miss Cavendish Poole, who had more character than the autumn had credited her, sent a note of congratulation that was warm enough to be genuine and specific enough to be her own words. It said simply, "I believe you will suit very well, and I am glad one of us is settled." It was signed Louisa, without ceremony. Nora read it twice and found she liked her. The wedding was in March, in the small chapel on the estate grounds, attended by a short list and a great deal of early spring light coming through the stone windows at an angle that was, Mrs. Carow said afterward, quite the nicest light she had seen in that chapel in 12 years of attending services there. Mrs. Carow was in the second row, very upright, holding her handkerchief with both hands. The cook, who had been told the guest list was limited to family and persons of particular connection, appeared at the back anyway, in her best dress, on the basis that 7 months was connection enough. The spring was mild, and the grounds were beginning. The library was finished in April. 842 volumes, catalogued and shelved and indexed in a hand that was both precise and legible, with marginal notes preserved where the original owners had left them, and blank end papers where they had not. Waiting, as blank pages wait, for whoever came next. On the evening of the catalogue's completion, he found her at the last shelf, her back to the door, running her fingers along the spines in the particular way she touched things she had spent real time on. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, and she knew he was there by the quality of the room's attention, and did not turn. This was its own kind of knowing, the body learning to register a specific presence before the eyes have confirmed it. "Done," she said. "I noticed," he said. She turned. He was holding the volume of Virgil, not open, just held, the way one holds something that has been set down and picked up many times until the holding is itself a kind of conversation. She crossed the room, and he put the book in her hands, and she opened it to the dedication page and read the words she already knew, and felt, without embarrassment, the grief and the gratitude of them together, which is what love looks like when it has survived something and is still standing in the same room in spring, with the fire going and the windows full of evening. Outside the library window, the last of the early spring cold was lifting from the lawn, and the grounds were quiet in the particular way. They are quiet at the end of a day that has been good, and the house that had held its breath in a ballroom in October was breathing easily, the way houses breathe when the person they have been waiting for has finally arrived and put down their trunk and decided to stay. She closed the book. She said his name. He said hers. It was enough. It had always been enough. The world had simply needed a little time to understand it. If this story reached you in the quiet of an evening, leave a word below. It is the kindest thing you can do for a story like this one.